Now, what I'm going to do is give you a little overview of urban development trends around the world. Half of my life I spend studying cities, and I just have a great time with it. This photo here, by the way, is Paris. There's this view, you know, that American cities sprawl, and that you go to Europe and you don't find sprawl, and everything's different, and of course, everything's wonderful and all that. That's the sprawl of Paris from 1954 to 1999. I will also go into what I call an urban tour by rental car. After going to Brazil last September, I started throwing up on the internet a series of articles called Urban Tours by Rental Car, because when I went to Sao Paulo, which is the largest city in Brazil and one of the 4 or 5 largest urban areas in the world with about 17 million people, I was struck by the fact that all of the urban planners condemn Sao Paulo unbelievably. You go to Sao Paulo, you see lack of planning. You see disorderliness, and what you see is millions of people who have moved there from northeastern Brazil who had nothing and moved to the shanty towns that surround Sao Paulo. And while indeed Sao Paulo does not look as nice as Portland or St. Louis, where I live now, the fact is Sao Paulo is a great city of hope to people. And for anybody to be standing around and talking about Manila and Sao Paulo and urban planning, you wonder what planet they're on. But in any event, let's talk first about density. Now, a lot of the anti-sprawl advocates get upset when I talk about density. But the fact is, if you don't have density, you have sprawl. That is all there is to it. The principal issue with respect to sprawl is density. If you have density, you don't have sprawl, generally speaking. Now, these pictures here, we show an aerial view of Bern, Switzerland. We have Nagoya, not Nagoya, Kyoto. How do you do this? Nagoya, Hong Kong. Densest part of Hong Kong, which is the most dense urban area in the world, is actually not on this side with the high apartment buildings over there in Kowloon. This happens to be Himeji, Japan, which is a beautiful city with a great castle. But in any event, let's talk about density for a moment, because density is crucial. How dense can things be? How dense should we allow things to be? Well, let's start with the Kowloon walled city in Hong Kong that was torn down by the British government in 1992. Density of 5 million people per square mile. Now, at 5 million people per square mile, it's pretty impressive. The government tore it down. Now, the highest density neighborhood I can find in the world is the San Juan Center, which is about 1.1 million people per square mile. Now, if you think back to the lower east side of New York that's fabled at this point for, say, 1910, and the terrible living conditions that immigrants lived in those days, but as terrible as they were a whole lot better than what they came from, that never achieved much more than 400,000 per square mile. So San Juan today is 3 times as dense as the lower east side was. If you go to New York City, which has the densest neighborhood in the United States, 230,000 per square mile. LA, believe it or not, has neighborhoods, has census tracts at 100,000 per square mile. Portland, which has all the anti-sprawl policies and whose missionaries go around the world talking about their great achievements in increasing densities, doesn't have a census tract of more than 25,000 per square mile. Now, think about that in terms of what I call Portland density units. If you look at the Kowloon walled city, it was 1,500 times as dense as Portland, and that's compared to the urban area. So the point is, densities can be a whole lot higher, and indeed it's clear to me why Metro some years ago decided not to expand the urban growth boundary. Why so? You could increase the density by 1,500 times. You don't need to expand the urban growth boundary. Now, the fact is, if you were to go and say, okay, let us populate all of the urban centers of the world at the density of the Kowloon walled city, it would take up the room of only 2½ Portland urban areas, about 1,200 square miles. So we're really wasting an awful lot of land, it's pretty clear in the world. Or if you were to do it at the density of San Juan Center, which is actually existing today, we'd need the urban area land of New York and Tokyo. So the point is, in regards to density, we're clearly wasting an awful lot of land, which just brings us to the real question. How shall we determine how much land shall be allowed to use? And you know how we do it? We do it by allowing the people to decide where and how they live. The fact is that the anti-sprawl movement has come up with no compelling reason for limiting the expansion of our cities. And I'm not here as an advocate of sprawl, I'm here as an advocate of allowing people to do what they want to do for a whole lot of reasons. And I won't bother to go into all the discussions we had last year about the failure of the anti-sprawl arguments, but this graphic gives you an idea about how large are the sprawling cities of the world. Hong Kong, with 128,000 people per square mile, most dense place in the first world, that is in the high-income world, 25 square miles. 25 square miles is one-half the size, less than one-half the size of what Portland was in 1950 before it more than doubled in size, and that's just the city of Portland. Mumbai at about 300 square miles. Paris, 1,000 square miles, an awful lot of land. And believe it or not, the most sprawling urban area in the world is New York, at 3,400 square miles. Tokyo is over 2,000. Chicago I didn't put in, but Chicago is more than 2,000. Many of you will be surprised to know that Boston now sprawls more than Los Angeles. In terms of population densities around the world, you see again the Hong Kong urban area at 128,000. You see Tokyo at about 15,000 per square mile. Paris at about a little under 10. Los Angeles, the most densely populated urbanized area in North America, north of the Rio Grande, slightly more densely populated, believe it or not, than Toronto, at about 7,100. New York at 5,300. Portland at 3,300, and Atlanta at 1,700. And I think Atlanta is probably the least dense major metropolitan area in the world. And Atlanta is also about to pass 5 million people in its metropolitan area, and is at this point the fastest growing large urban area in the developed world. But the fact is, for all these density numbers we look at, densities are falling. From 1960 to 1990, and some of the international data on urban densities is very difficult. This is from the Newman and Kenworthy database published in the late 1990s, I believe it was. What you saw in Canada, urban densities dropping 20%. In the United States, about 15% from 1960 to 1990. Now, granted, we started from a lower base in the United States. Western European densities dropping 29%, and Asian densities dropping 17%. I only know of one city, Vancouver, BC, that has more people today than it had at any point in the past, that has not either expanded its boundaries or combined with someplace else, or didn't have a whole bunch of empty land to develop. Virtually all of the first world cities that were in that condition have lost population, and that's whether we're talking about Asia or whether we're talking about Europe. For example, Copenhagen has lost about the same percentage of its population as, say, Minneapolis or St. Paul, or many of the Midwestern areas that have lost population through the years. Now, into all this comes the urban planner, who wants to stop sprawl, because sprawl is to urban planning what Lucifer was to the Old Testament. My father's a Pentecostal preacher, by the way. And so what you get is a situation where we try to control sprawl. And what happens is we get a reaction to it. And the reaction is to cause sprawl to be greater. Now, actually, the father of smart growth, I'm going to suggest two fathers of smart growth. One whose name I don't know, but whoever came up with the idea of the London Greenbelt was the real father of smart growth. The London Greenbelt was imposed in the 1950s, and the result has been a splattering and explosion of sprawl beyond the urban limits of London that have created a situation in which low-income people and middle-income people who live in the far suburbs of London can't get good work because it's just plain too far. We've made the city in London so inefficient that it is very difficult for low and middle-income people to find good jobs. If they had been smart and followed the Parisian model, for example, that follows the American model, it would be a much more efficient city. But in Milan, if you go to Milan, you find that in the last 30 years, 500,000 people, almost a third of the population, has left. They have moved largely to the sprawling, really not sprawling, splattering villages north of the city, headed on up to the Alps. We see it in the San Francisco Bay Area. Just last week, the Census Bureau told us that the Bay Area had increased. Actually, they gave us the population estimates for the counties. If you add them up, the counties in the San Francisco, San Jose, I refuse to say San Jose, San Francisco, because, you know, unfortunately now San Jose is larger. But those counties gained a total of 61,000 people. Now, Congressman Blumenauer last night was noting that the Bay Area is less affordable than Portland, and there's no question about that. And he was implying, probably out of not knowing what's going on in the Bay Area, that's proof that Portland policies are okay. Well, in fact, the Bay Area started smart growth policies long before Portland ever thought of it. San Jose had an urban growth boundary, what, 1975, Randall? 74, okay. We've got urban growth boundaries all over. We've got impact fees all over. We've got, you name the kind of land regulation you can have, and you've got it in the Bay Area. The Bay Area, with 7 million people, grew slower than San Joaquin County, which is the county in which Stockton is located, where all sorts of people are moving because that's where they can get affordable housing. Go down the road to Modesto, you find Stanislaus County up 45,000, Merced County up 21,000, where people are moving close to the coast mountains so they can drive to work in the Bay Area. And what's happened, and I'm not sure exactly the dynamic that's happening yet, but I have some suspicions. Can you believe Sacramento grew 3 times as much in the last 3 years as the entire San Francisco Bay Area? The fact is that Glazer and Giorgio of Harvard showed us some years ago that virtually all the difference in affordability and housing in the United States has to do with land use planning. And there's no doubt that some places in California are more affordable than Portland. That's only because bad policies were adopted there an awful lot earlier. Most of these policies were adopted right after the passage of Proposition 13 in 1978. Last night, Congressman Blumenauer talked about how he didn't believe the National Association of Home Builders Opportunity Index, and I'd be happy to have a debate with him like I did 2 years ago in San Francisco on that subject. But okay, I'll grant, let's not even talk about the National Association of Home Builders. Maybe he trusts the U.S. Census Bureau. This is the relationship of increase in house price from 1990 to 2000 to the increase in median income. Median house price to median income. Oregon wins the championship. I mean, they've been cheated out of a couple of college football championships in the last couple of years, both Oregon and Oregon State, but they win the housing cost championship. Number 1. Number 2, distant second, Utah at 37%. Last night, Congressman Blumenauer suggested he didn't understand why things were less affordable in Denver. He was suggesting maybe Denver had market-oriented policies and Portland has planning-oriented policies. Denver actually has a voluntarily imposed, very strong urban growth boundary, which is why my friend, I constantly tell my friend, the governor of Colorado, that it is time we start looking at how we're doing things in the Denver area because we are increasing prices of housing very substantially. The national average, 14%, 15%. Notice that Georgia. Now, oftentimes delegations of Georgians from Atlanta come up here to find out how to do things, and in a number of speeches recently in Atlanta, I've suggested that the train is going in the wrong direction. Actually, the Portlanders need to be going to Atlanta. What we have in Atlanta is a situation where housing affordability stayed very strong, and we talk about inclusivity and integration and so on. Atlanta can be proud of the fact that having grown almost as much in the last 10 years as all of the population of the Portland area in Oregon, the fact is 1/3 of the new residents in suburban Atlanta are African American. 20% are Hispanic. Atlanta, which many people think of as a sprawling, terrible place, has no reason to take a back seat on diversity and solving racial problems to anybody. I don't care where you're talking about. Now let's talk about home ownership and sprawl around the world. In the United States, core cities tend to have about a 50%, 49% home ownership rate. As you go to the first ring suburbs, second ring suburbs, third ring suburbs, home ownership goes up. This is from a review of U.S. Census data from 2000. First ring suburbs had all their housing average was built in 59, second 79, and the third was after 79. Go to Paris, what do we find? In the Ville de Paris, we find 30% of the people own their own houses. In the inner suburbs, or the Petite Couronne as it's called, 44%. In the Grand Couronne, the outer part of the Paris urban area, 54% of the people own their own homes. Let's go to Tokyo, and we can do the same thing in Osaka, but we won't. In Tokyo, prefecture of Tokyo, which is as close as we can come to the core of Tokyo, 41%. In the suburban prefectures of Chiba, Saitama, and Kanagawa, 59%. And then you get to the exurban prefectures and you're at 70%. Around the world we find the same thing. Home ownership is higher in the suburbs. And the reason home ownership is so important is because people buy homes, the value of their homes rises, they get equity, They send the kids to school, they start new businesses, they create wealth. That's why home ownership is so important, and that's why I'm not terribly upset if we subsidize home ownership just a little bit. Let's talk about urban transport for a minute, and I'm not talking about transit. I'm talking about how people actually how people actually move, not about how planners think they move. I throw this slide up as a picture of Sydney Central Station. There is this view that freeways have created sprawl. Well, again, you go around Europe, you find sprawl. You go to Japan, you find sprawl. And the interesting thing is you go to Australia, and you find virtually the same extent of sprawl in the United States. But the problem is that they never built the freeways. They forgot about freeways. Only recently have they begun to build toll roads after the sprawl has occurred in Sydney and Melbourne. David Hartgen at University of North Carolina has done some strong research that shows that this so-called connection between freeways and sprawl, there really isn't much to it at all. Now, the density we should be concerned about is density of cars. Because as population goes up, the density of cars goes up. Notice that the highest density of cars is in Western European first world nations and in Asian first world nations, and at the lowest density of cars per square mile in urban areas, is in the United States, Australia, and New Zealand. What happens as you increase the number of cars is they're driven more, so that the vehicle hours of travel per square mile in urban areas in the United States, which are the least dense along with Australia, is by far the lowest. Western Europe is higher, and Asia is still higher. Traffic congestion is worse where density is higher. Now, the interesting thing beyond that is that air pollution gets worse as speeds retard and as there is more slow going and stop and go. If there's anything we can do in the long run to solve the air pollution problem, which of course Joel Schwartz will rightly tell you is going away technologically, but as regards a transportation solution, it's getting the traffic moving. We need to have the traffic moving at 35 miles an hour without stopping. It isn't doing that anywhere. We've got a long way to go. In the United States, research by people for the Federal Highway Administration says essentially that traffic goes up at 70% the rate of population increase, population density increase. So that says, of course, per capita driving decreases as density goes up, but the overall traffic goes up. And that makes things worse, and of course, that means there's more air pollution. And, you know, we don't breathe all of the air pollution in the urban area. We only breathe the air pollution that's right below our nose, and that creates it a lot worse. Higher density also means longer commutes. In the United States, we have very short commutes, the shortest in the world, really. Maybe Canada's a little bit less in some cases, but 25-minute average work trip in the United States. In the Paris urban region, almost more than 35 minutes. And by the way, the further you go out in the suburbs, the better it gets for the most part there. Hong Kong, remember, 128,000 people per square mile. It has a in the United States, 2% of travel is on transit. In Hong Kong, 74% of travel is on transit. The place is only 25 square miles. You think, well, here, my goodness, people can't be spending much time going to work. Well, yeah, actually, they're spending over 40 minutes. Or go to Tokyo with by far the best transit system in the world, a transit system that carries about double the number of total daily riders as the entire transit, all the transit systems in the United States combined. And by the way, of course, you've heard that transit can never pay for itself. Actually, it does in Tokyo, and in Osaka, and in Nagoya, and in Seoul, and a whole lot of other places. But in any event, the point is that in Tokyo, with the great transit system Tokyo has, 53 minutes is the average travel time getting to work, double what we're faced with now. Last night, Congressman Blumenauer criticized the travel time index of the Texas Transportation Institute. He didn't say it was wrong. He just said it wasn't really the indicator to look at. He suggested that the reason the travel time index, which is really a measure of speed, really, how fast you're going during peak hour compared to how fast you could go if there were no congestion, he was really saying what we ought to be doing is looking at hours of delay per capita, et cetera, because trips are shorter in Portland. Well, of course trips are shorter in Portland. Portland's not that big. We're not talking about Seattle. We're not talking about Denver. Portland is a medium-sized metropolitan area, a medium-sized urban area. If you look at the data for urban areas between 1 million and 2 million people, what you find is Portland's travel is the slowest of the group. The only communities that are close are urbanized areas that are parts of much larger urban areas, and I don't think are fair to even compare San Jose, which is in the San Francisco area, Riverside, San Bernardino, LA, and Fort Lauderdale, West Palm Beach, which next year will all be combined into one because the Census Bureau has now combined them into one. If you look at the 14 urban areas that are not a part of a larger metropolitan area, you find that the average 30-minute trip takes 36 minutes during peak period in those areas, and the average trip in Portland that would take 30 minutes during uncongested times, if you could find that. I mean, I cannot believe what Portlanders put up with in terms of traffic. It is unbelievable. Nothing like it I've seen in the world except, and I would have to say Auckland is competitive. Auckland, New Zealand, though, they've had similar pretty bad policies. So in any event, there's a real problem of traffic congestion in Portland. Now here we look at what Portland has projected for increase in car and transit ridership back in their planning process in the mid to late 1990s. And I use this as an example for other places around the nation. In Portland, everything is theoretically right. It is the nirvana of urban planning. All of the policies are right. And yet, with all of the things they're going to do, the urban growth boundary, which by the way has already been expanded beyond the point that was planned for 2040. That's the big secret nobody's telling you, but that's another matter. Even with all of the things they're doing, the transit, the urban growth boundary, etc., huge majority of the new travel, according to Metro, the very people that administer the urban growth boundary, most of the new travel will be by car. And I can show you the same chart for virtually anywhere around the world. If you want to go to Perth, if you want to go to Phoenix or Paris, or you want to go to Atlanta, which of course everybody hates who loves urban planning, the fact is if we looked at the chart for Atlanta, the transit line would be a little bit narrower, but not much difference. The fact is virtually all travel, all new travel, whether we talk about Portland or Phoenix or Perth or Paris, is going to be automobile travel, at least in the foreseeable future. So now let's talk about transit. The basic problem with transit, it's wonderful, and indeed I sponsored the amendment in 1980 to create the rail fund. What Tom didn't tell you is in order to get Baxter Ward second, I had to make it all rail. I wanted to put it into a busway or rail, but that's all right, Tom. We've had our disputes before. In any event, that's my carte orange, which is the monthly pass in Paris. I'm privileged to be serving a stint at the moment for the third year in a row as a visiting professor at the Conservatoire National des Arts at Métier in Paris. And of course, when I live in Paris, I'm on transit, which is what it is all about. We do not decide we're going to go to work because we like a particular way, because we like trains or we like cars. This isn't college football or high school football. It is about how we live. And in fact, around the world, because of changing trends, transit market shares are dropping. I can find no place where highway market shares in an urban area are dropping very much. There is a claim that in Toulouse, the auto market share has dropped from 71 to 70% as a result of building a subway which probably cost $1 billion. In Zurich, where they're building a new belt route around the city, tunnels, billions of dollars, there's also a claim that auto market share has dropped 1 percentage point. We're not talking about anything being changed, despite the fact that we have huge amounts of rail transit and other construction being done around the country. You see, Western Europe, Canada, Asia, and the United States, transit market shares are declining. And again, if one wants to look at the census data, the percentage of people riding transit to work in the Portland area in 2000 was still lower than in 1980. It was higher than 1990, but lower than 1980 before they had any light rail. Now, what's wrong with transit? Nothing wrong with transit. It is wonderful. But this picture says it all. Why is it that all of the people on the Don Valley Parkway in Toronto are not on that train? Have any idea? Probably it's because the train isn't going where the people want to go. Now there's this view among urban planners that says if we just make the congestion bad enough, people will get out of transit and onto the train. Well, one wonders, how bad does the congestion have to get before the people in those cars get on that train to go where they're not going? The basic problem we have is that transit is not auto-competitive. It is auto-competitive to downtown Portland, it's auto-competitive to downtown Los Angeles, in the core of Paris, in the core of Tokyo, but for the vast majority of travel around the modern urban area outside Hong Kong, which is the one exception, transit is not competitive. And it's not that people don't like transit. Americans love transit. 75% of the people who work in New York below 59th Street ride transit. Why? Not because they hate cars, but because transit's the best way to get there. The problem is, many of our urban planners don't know the difference between downtown Portland and Manhattan south of 59th Street. There is one place in the world where we do have auto-competitive transit, and that is Hong Kong. We've talked about that. Very inexpensive system for Hong Kong. It's inexpensive because it's largely bus-oriented, though they have a profitable subway and a profitable light rail, commuter rail line. The basic point, however, is that because the ridership is so high and the service area is so small, they are able to produce this transit system with only about 1.5% of their gross domestic product. Now, the basic problem with transit, however, is if you double the size of the service area, you increase by 4 times the number of potential origins and destinations. So if, for example, you were to decide to spend, say, half your gross regional product in Portland to provide Hong Kong transit densities, you would not equal Hong Kong service coverage because the Hong Kong level is appropriate for Hong Kong, not for an area as sprawling as Portland. Basic problem in Portland, and I use it as an example, you can see here. I've taken a suburban location on the east side, Holgate South, around 205, and I said, okay, in 30 minutes, not counting walking time, most of us find it's easier to walk to the garage than to walk to the bus stop, but in 30 minutes, how far can we get on transit and how far can we get by car? The green is how far we can get by car. It's stylized. I mean, it may not be perfect. It's based upon some algorithms. The red is where you can get on transit. And that's the basic problem. If all you have is transit, that's all the further you can get. And so when we start talking about providing transit choice, the problem is this: transit choice for who? Transit choice for the 10 to 15% of people who work downtown. And we're going to have the other 85% of the people pay for this transit choice, and they don't get it because there's no transit system that has been conceived in the mind of anybody but me that can solve the problem. But here's the transit system that will solve the problem. We need a grid of automated guideway, no more than 1/2 mile apart. Portland's about as large as it can get before we get to the point we can't even be competitive from a speed-wise standpoint anymore. And that system in Portland would cost about the amount of money that you earn every year in gross income in the Portland area. The point is there is no transit vision. And I heard recently a governor of a state criticized for a new bond issue because there wasn't enough transit in it to try to get people out of their cars, as if that's what we ought to be doing, but let's say for the moment we should be. The fact is that we ought to be building transit when transit is more cost effective than the alternatives. And we ought not to be building it when it isn't. And for the most part, it isn't. And that's what the data shows around the world. Which brings us back to Nikolai Ceausescu, who is indeed, Randall's wrong, is indeed the father of the smart grid. And by the way, I'm going to have the privilege, I go back to Paris in the morning, and then on Monday night I go to Bucharest for a week-long conference, and next presentation there are going to be all sorts of pictures of torn down villages in Romania. What Ceausescu did in the 80s before he was knocked out of power was he decided urbanization was the way to go, so he started tearing down villages in the countryside and forcing people into high-rises in Bucharest. Ceausescu is the father of smart growth. If we have a vision that says we want 10%, 20%, or 30% of people on transit, there's only one way to do it. That is to tear down the suburbs. I'm not being cute here. Ceausescu had the vision. The interesting thing about it is that the smart growth and the anti-sprawl people who propound this craziness have never really thought out the implications of what it is they're suggesting. But now let's talk very quickly about a rental car tour of the New York world. It all started in Paris for me, and by the way, this picture is a picture, many of these pictures are probably not what you've seen if you've been to Europe, and certainly not what you've seen in the travel guide, and that's precisely the problem. This is an auto dealership mall in the western suburbs of Paris. I forgot to take a picture of the one in Valencia a couple of weeks ago. I've had the privilege, as I say, for 3 years of spending 2 months in Paris. My first year, you see my flat there, within walking, well, everything's within walking distance in the Ville de Paris, which is only 40 square miles. And by the way, the urban area of Paris is 1,000 square miles beyond it. I mean, it sprawls as much as Dallas almost. There's my flat very close to the Garnier Opera, a very tasteful place. The Bastille Opera is really ugly. I don't know why anybody goes there. The next year, I moved to the 7th arrondissement. I wanted a view. You can see there my view of the Eiffel Tower from my room, surrounded. My favorite place, though, except it's awful cold there. It's as cold there as in Portland, and they have not yet discovered interior heating there. Currently, I'm living in the 5th arrondissement in Paris. Very nice place. You can see my flat up there, 5 stories high, and you can imagine how much more there would be here if I weren't walking up and down those stairs about 3 or 4 times a day. But here's the basic point. You have all been, those of you who have been to Europe have had these kinds of things. You know, the tourist map. And I guarantee you, if you go to everything that is on this map of Paris, except for Versailles, you will have been everywhere that is of interest to anybody from the United States or anywhere. This is the map of the tourist. Regretfully, it is also the map of the urban planner, who believes that by sitting in a drinking cafe across the street from the Louvre, they can get an idea about what urbanization is like in Paris. Well, the fact is, this is what you need to see Paris as an urban planner. And by the way, Paris is a compact urban area. It only covers 1,000 square miles. The explosion that has been created by the urban planning policies of the British government in London creates a book that's twice as big as this 1,400 pages of maps. So this is your Thomas guide to Paris, and that's why I decided it was time to start putting some stuff up with the web about what I call a rental car tour of urban areas, because you cannot see urban areas on transit. If all you do is ride transit to see an urban area, you're going to see the urban area of the 19th century. Here's the basic problem. The blue in the first little slide is the walking city in Paris of 1700. Then you see how by 1860 transit comes in, not great transit, but it's better than walking. The city is much larger now. The blue represents the old walking city. Now, of course, the city, the urban area covers 1,050 square miles. Yeah. You can hardly see the blue walking city, which is, by the way, the only place anybody who's coming from here to go as a tourist needs to go. My problem is that the urban planners have never ventured outside that area. You see how big the city has become at this point. Now, if urban planners from Europe were to come and make their judgments about the United States, the way our urban planners make their judgments about Europe, that they would go to Orlando and see that site and take pictures home and say, you know, that's what our country ought to look like. That's what America. And there is this view, and Randall got at this a few moments ago, these shocking data that I hope you really picked up. 85–86% of travel in the United States is by car, 79% in Europe. Don't let anybody tell you that that's a significant amount of difference. People are in their cars in Europe. Now, we often hear about how Americans have a love affair with the automobile. Well, I wonder about a love affair of the automobile. Who is having the love affair with the automobile? When you see the current price, that's the gas station about 2 blocks from my house. You see that unleaded is what? Unleaded is $5.12 a gallon at the moment. Now, I would recommend if any of you move to Europe, get a diesel car. It's much more cost-effective, only $4 an hour, or $4 a gallon. But let's look at what's going on in Europe. Up above, at the top of the slide, you see the amazing site in West Atlanta, near that development. Oh, no, it wasn't a different slide, sorry. It's hard to see because all those signs. There must be 10 signs pointing in a direction to new housing developments, pointing to the opportunities for families to get ahead, to gain wealth, and to live a very nice life. Below it, you see Valencia, Spain. The language is different. That's all that is different about it. One needs to be careful not to confuse how people live with how they would like to live. If you want to know how people would like to live, you go to the nice areas of town and see how they live. Parisians do not prefer to live in 20-story Soviet-style apartment blocks. Yes, there are some people that prefer to live on the Upper East Side or the Upper West Side. No question, and they ought to continue to do that. But the fact is, for the most part, people do not prefer that kind of living. This is the Montauk section of Hong Kong, which many people wrongly suggest is the most dense section of Hong Kong. It isn't. It's only about 150,000 people per square mile, really pretty sparsely populated. That is not my house in O'Fallon, Illinois, in the corner. That is a house in the southwestern suburbs of Paris. Toulouse, France, they go in more for a Spanish style there. London, that's interior. That's not suburbs. That's inside. That's actually maybe in the outer boroughs. I can't remember which side of the line it's on, but that's actually in London. Whole neighborhood of houses that look like that. Seville, Spain. Construction going on in Spain at this point like you can't believe. Or you can look at Lisbon, Portugal. Now, not everybody lives like that, but you can find this all over. Or Copenhagen, they actually have a barbecue back there. It's unbelievable. Or Stockholm. That neighborhood was created, and Pat Ziliakis would know this neighborhood. This neighborhood was a famous planned neighborhood created, I think, before the First World War. It was very early.
In the 20s, I believe.
Yeah, it may have been the 20s.
20s, yeah.
And then we have Antwerp. I mean, everywhere I go, I can take these pictures. Zurich, not quite as nice as Zurich. Geneva, very rich place. Stuttgart, Germany, where, by the way, they have the same urban splatter going on, where all the urbanization is happening all over the place. There's no more sprawl, it's just people living further and further away. And then, of course, our friends in Canada who are often besmirched by local urban planners who like to suggest that things are radically different in Canada. Well, they really aren't. You can go to Montreal, looks just like America, Tokyo, Osaka, a sister city of Portland. I remember delivering the Oregonian the day that the announcement was made that Portland was selecting Sapporo as its first sister city. Sapporo, a little bit of snow there, very American-looking place. And then what else is happening around the world is the dispersion of employment locations. This is São Paulo. Now notice that business center. That's the Luis Marini Business Center along the western periphery of the city, though the suburbs go well beyond that. They don't have a subway line there. They're currently building more subway lines in a community that doesn't have enough bus service, it doesn't have enough cars, and has poverty like we've never dreamed of at this point. And someday they hope to have a subway station at Luis Marini. Unfortunately, Luis Marini is about a mile or two long, and there'll be one subway station in the middle, and of course, only half of the center will be served. We've also heard frequently about how freeways ruin the cities, how they cut through the cities. The Dan Ryan, south of Chicago, an awful scar through the city of Chicago, and I'm pleased to see the housing projects in Chicago being torn down at this point. Well, how about Zurich, where the central rail lines coming into the station in the middle of the city are the equivalent of a 75-lane freeway. And I can take you all over Europe and show you how the central cities of Europe have been scarred by these huge takings of land through the years by rail systems. You see the nice freeway leading into Yokohama. And one of my favorites is that picture in the corner there. That is one of the biggest car washes I ever saw, and that's in Geneva, but it's not in the suburbs, it's actually in the central city of Geneva, which, by the way, has 300,000 people, meaning it has about the same number of people as Clark County, and has worse traffic congestion than Los Angeles, because it's too dense. Or we've got strip malls in Sapporo, anywhere else you want. What's happening also all over Europe, where you drive, you find these rural distribution centers being built all over the middle of nowhere. It's happening here too, but I mean, the world is changing. We have a suburban business center under construction there in Valencia, and then of course we're all concerned about mixed use. We want to have mixed use development. And indeed the Germans do that. You see how the cars take the sidewalk there in Oberhausen. So what we have is a situation where the American dream is real. It has made this nation the richest country in the world on a purchasing power parity basis. And it is, a lot of it has to do with home ownership and the American dream. The American dream has become international. This is a picture of a housing development in the northern suburbs of Tokyo. But the other thing is something in French, and I'm very bad in French, but some of you perhaps can figure it out. That is something that pops up on your machine if you go into Google in Paris. And what it's suggesting is this company can get you a green card. Now, I have been out of country for 2 months at this point. It may very well be that when you go into Google in this country, you get an ad popping up telling you how it is you can learn to, how it is you can get permission to live in France. I don't know, maybe so. In the metro in Paris, you see the same thing at the end of many cars. Get your carte verte, your green card, this way. And why is it that so many people want to come here? Now, by the way, in fairness, you're also going to find sometimes when people will find similar advertisements for Canada, because Canada is rightly considered just like the United States in terms of opportunity by people who want to have a better life. So that says an awful lot about the American dream. And the American dream has to do with aspiration. This is a picture of Chenonceau Palace or Chateau in France. You see how those steps have been worn in the rock there, in the stone, and on the outside you can see the river. Generations, if not centuries, of children and small people have gone there and kneeled or stood there so that they can see out. That's human aspiration. People want a better life, and that's what we're talking about. And people have better lives when they are allowed to do what they want. Now, it gets us to the final slide, the purpose of urban planning, because, you know, a lot of people think that urban planning is real important. I think it's real important too. I think the purpose of urban planning is to provide the structure and the infrastructure that is necessary for us to live like we want to live. That's what urban planners ought to be doing. The basic problem, however, you see here at the Every RER station in the southeastern Paris suburbs. You see, the planners want the people to get to the railroad station on the paved walk of the pathway, but the people seem to want to go a different way. Now, that's the basic problem of urban planning today. We have to get the urban planners to put the sidewalk over there, not over there. Thank you very much.